My name is Bob Milgram. I'm co-chair of the Humanities and Sciences Department at the School of Visual Arts. And basically, I want to welcome you all. Okay, I'm not? Is it okay now? Okay. I'd just like to welcome you all to this event, a very important event. There are great lessons to be learned from the Vietnam War, especially for us now at this point involved in the endless war against terror. I'm sure the people that are going to speak with you will draw the connections between the bogus attack in the Tonkin Gulf on an American destroyer, an attack that never happened that led us into that war with all the casualties you just heard about, and the bogus connection between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, the bogus contention of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and so on. I'm not going to take time to go through all this. Most of you are already all too aware. Two people here were, thank you, basically contributors and creators of a collection of poetry, Winning Hearts and Minds, about the done all by Vietnam combat veterans, a book that I use in the classroom, it's a lot of years, since 1972, and it meant a lot to all of us, and that's Jan Barry. I'm sorry. I think I'd better stop right here and turn it over to Mac.
Thank you, Bob. I want to also welcome you to our teach-in. What's interesting, and I can't claim to have been aware of that when I planned this, but today is the actual 50th anniversary of the first teach-in, which was held at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. And it was planned by, tentatively and hesitantly planned by 10 professors and 10 equally hesitant students, members of SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, not knowing what they would bringing into existence, whether or not it would get any response from the community, the college community or the student body. What they found was that at 8 p.m. when it started, just about now, some 220 college professors showed up and some 3,000 students showed up for the first teach-in. It went from 8 p.m. till 8 a.m. tomorrow morning. So we can be here for a while if you like, except SVA is going to throw us out of here at 10 o'clock. And it was probably the first opportunity many students and many college professors may have as well to learn about this strange place, Vietnam, that pretty much no one had heard of back then. It was an opportunity for people to discuss whether or not they were being informed and whether they were being informed the truth about what was going on. They discussed the war and they discussed the draft. So it's fitting, I think, that 50 years later, we again meet to discuss the Vietnam War. Philip Jones Griffith, who you just met, went to Vietnam, a photojournalist, a photographer, freelance, worked for Magnum, and went to Vietnam in 1966, I believe, and started to do what he does. Unfortunately, his images were not highly saleable. No one wanted them because they kind of pictured what we don't want to know about war, what we don't want to see about war. He did a lot from the Vietnamese perspective, not the mythological American perspective that we wanted to to embrace. Eventually, I think it was 1971, he continued about 3 years doing his photography in Vietnam. In 1971, he published Vietnam Inc. Vietnam Inc. is pretty much hailed as one of the best pieces of photojournalism of its time. It had such a dramatic impact on how the war was being perceived. Probably what heralds Philip Jones Griffiths most was that President II of South Vietnam acknowledged his work, and I quote, he said, "Let me tell you, there are many people I don't want back in my country, but I can assure you Mr. Griffiths' name is at the top of the list." So evidently he was doing something right. So we have a wonderful, diverse program that we have. We have some great speakers for you, and we're relying on our technology to enable us to talk with Da Nang, Vietnam, over Skype. Hopefully, everyone keep their fingers crossed that the technology is going to work. I am privileged to introduce our first speaker, Susan Schnall. She was an active duty Navy nurse during the American conflict in Vietnam in 1969. And I mean, she's proud of this, and well, she should be. She was tried and found guilty by a general court-martial for conduct unbecoming an officer. And here's what she And this is what she was doing. I mean, she's going to tell you the story, but she commandeered a plane, and she started dropping leaflets all over the place, and they didn't appreciate her efforts, I don't think. She has been active in the Medical Committee for Human Rights, Medical Aid for Indochina, and GI Coffee Houses. Susan is a member of the core of the Vietnam Agent Orange Relief and Responsibility Campaign, Veterans for Peace, Vietnam Veterans, Subversive Vietnam Veterans Against the War. She organized and led a delegation of science public health professionals to Vietnam in 2013 to survey the land that had been contaminated by Agent Orange, and I'm sure she'll tell you about that. She is now teaching at NYU in the School of Professional Studies. She teaches health policy and planning. And for 31 years, Susan worked in the executive administration at a number of public hospitals in New York City, retiring as a very young person from Bellevue Hospital Center in 2006. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Susan Schnall.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, and it's a pleasure to see all of you. And you don't need to turn the lights off. I teach, and I'm always concerned that my students are going to fall asleep. So,
I thought you can see your slides.
Right, I just have to get them on. Could somebody help us just get the slideshow up? And I'll start. You can all hear me, right? Okay. I just wanted to continue what Mac had started in terms of a little bit about myself and how I found myself in the United States Navy in 1967. And I think about it today and think, yeah, I should have known better, right? I knew about the conflict going on in Vietnam. But I thought I would join as a nurse and I'd heal those people who had been wounded by war. I went in to take care of the guys who had been sent overseas. And what I realized is hearing their stories, hearing what they told me they had participated in, and what they had seen in Vietnam, that I was now a part of the military establishment. And I said, no, I can't do this. I feel that it conflicts with my moral compass. So I need to do something. This is 1967. I was just speaking with Jan Berry and said, you know, in 1967, when I went into the military, Howard Levy was being court-martialed. And I remember thinking, wow, if he can stand up to the military, maybe at some point I'll have enough courage to say something. It wasn't until a year and a half later, when we were organizing a GI and Veterans March for Peace in the San Francisco Bay Area, that I got the idea, and it was not a particularly original idea, but we had to distribute flyers and information to members of the military so they could participate. We put posters up at my hospital, which was Oak Knoll Naval Hospital in Oakland, California. It was a group of GIs, corpsmen and corps waves, who I worked with. So we put our posters up and we handed out the flyers, and they were all torn down. And then I remember seeing on the news, and those of you who are my generation will remember this, that the United States military was dropping flyers in the southern part of Vietnam, urging the Vietnamese to go to camps where they would be safe. And I thought, you know, if the United States can do this in Vietnam, why can't I do that in the United States? I had a friend who was a pilot, and we loaded up this private plane, a single-engine plane, and dropped flyers announcing the peace demonstration on the Presidio, on Treasure Island, on Yerba Buena Island, on Oak Knoll Naval Hospital, and on the deck of an aircraft carrier that was stationed at Alameda Naval Air Station. And to this day, I remember the pilot saying to me, Susan, tell me if you see planes outside. I said, if I see planes, it'll be a little too late, I think. But nothing happened. So that was our publicity for the GI and Veterans March for Peace on October 12th of 1968. And as Max said, I faced a captain's mast, an Article 32 hearing, and then a general court-martial, at which I was found guilty of disobeying a general Navy regulation because I participated in the anti-war demonstrations while wearing my uniform. My defense was General Westmoreland could go to Congress and be positive and ask for more money for this war in Vietnam. I can wear my uniform speaking out about peace. That was one of my defenses. The other one was conduct of becoming an officer and a gentlewoman by dropping the flyers on the military bases, urging people to disaffect from the war. And I said, yes, that was true, but in my worldview, that was conduct becoming an officer, because one did what one's conscience said this was what we had to do. So that takes you back a few years to 1969. As I said, I was found guilty. I faced 5 years at hard labor. The problem at this time was, where were they going to put a woman? So they gave me, the court-martial board gave me a sentence of 6 months at hard labor. But because they had a General Navy regulation that said if a woman received a sentence under a year, she didn't necessarily have to serve it. So they sent me back to full duty. But they placed me off of the active duty units because we continued to organize. So let me take you back to those years and start with a picture of Vietnam before the United States got heavily involved. And you know, I'm saying that kind of with tongue in cheek because there's some information I'd like to share with you tonight. First, to show you where Vietnam is. It is 6,000 miles away from the United States. There was never an immediate threat to this country, to the safety and security of this country. That was obvious. It is surrounded by the Gulf of Tonkin, and please take a look at where the Gulf of Tonkin is. It is off the coast of Vietnam. It's right there. Is that international waters? I don't know. You be the judge. And we'll talk about the Gulf of Tonkin. Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The French were defeated by the Vietnamese in 1954 at a place in the northern part of the country called Dien Bien Phu. These were the French headlines shortly thereafter. I don't think it ever occurred to France that they could possibly lose their colonial battles in Vietnam. But let's go back to 1950. In 1950, this is before the French left Vietnam, there were advisors from the United States working with the French. How many? Take a look at this. So in 1950, the United States government was involved in Vietnam. Not a whole lot of information about that. 30,000, 300,000 small arms, millions of dollars that this government put in to work with the French, and the French still were defeated in 1954. The Geneva Accords were signed. There was agreement by parties. There would be free elections in Vietnam by 1956. They were never held. There was fear on the part of the Western colonials that Ho Chi Minh was going to be elected president. And so they said, no, we're going to go in even more heavily and send more troops into Vietnam. From 1955 to 1961, 3,200 military advisors from the United States. So we increased the number of advisors, and some of you may remember the stories about advisors, and I know some of us said, oh, CIA advisors, right? Well, this is what the advisors look like. Pretty obvious that they were part of the United States military, even in those years when we were still supposed to be advising. I'll take you through the Gulf of Tonkin. Some of you may remember that that was the famous incident off of the coast of Vietnam. The USS Maddox, for a long time, had been sending surveillance planes over the north to see what was going on. There was a skirmish in August 2nd, and then on August 4th, there were what is known today and what has been admitted to by the United States, the ghosts of Tonkin. There was no real skirmish. However, President Johnson used that as an excuse to increase the number of troops that were going to Vietnam. They went in through Da Nang Harbor, which became one of the major Marine bases during the conflict. Let me just share with you quickly the impact of the American war in Vietnam. On the United States, there were about 3.5 million troops that served in Southeast Asia. And remember, it was Vietnam, it was Laos, it was Cambodia. There was a secret war in Laos, for which information has come out over the last few years. There were American troops based on the border between Vietnam and Cambodia. There were guys that refused to go out on maneuvers, and they were frightened that they were going to get court-martialed. So we were all over Southeast Asia. In the United States, there were 58,200 Americans who were killed while they were in Vietnam. I was asked the other day by a young high school student, so if an American serviceman or woman died after the war, if they died of a different disease, of an Agent Orange-related disease, were their names put on the wall in Washington? And the answer is no, they were not. We have said there are 58,200 American deaths as a result of the conflict, and that's the story. In Vietnam, there were 3.8 million civilians killed. This conflict took place in Vietnam, on the ground in Vietnam. The people were heavily bombed, and we used all sorts of different armaments. 3.8 million civilians, 1.8 million Vietnamese soldiers. Important to understand that Vietnam is a relatively small country the size of New Mexico. The United States dropped 7.8 million tons of munitions on this country, which is more than we used on Germany and Japan during the Second World War. Some of you may remember the general's favorite quote, which was, "We are going to bomb this country back to the Stone Age." It's estimated that about 800,000 tons of these bombs failed to explode. So they remain in the ground in Vietnam. Between 1961 and 1961, remember, is before the Gulf of Tonkin, which was 1964. 1961, Kennedy signed the approval to begin the use of herbicides in southern and central Vietnam. And so we started spraying the countryside with Agent Orange, purple, white, blue herbicides, the purpose of which was to destroy the forests, to destroy the farms, to destroy the food supply, and in so doing, to destroy any kind of cover that the Viet Cong may have had in battling American troops. Think about it. The food supply for civilians, for women and children who were not part of this conflict. And we destroyed it. Over 20% of the land, there were multiple flights over and over again with the use of these herbicides. The issue with Agent Orange, and I'll just give you kind of a couple of seconds of additional information. The issue with Agent Orange is that it contained minute traces of dioxin. Dioxin is one of the most harmful chemicals known to human beings. The chemical companies, your favorites, Dow and Monsanto, knew that this Agent Orange was contaminated with dioxin, yet they continued to use it. Their own employees were getting sick with liver cancer and terrible skin problems, but they never said anything about it. And their concern was they needed to keep on producing it for the war effort. They needed to keep on producing it for their stockholders. Just quickly, this is the map of South and Central Vietnam, and the reason I'm showing it to you is because if you go towards the middle of the country, Quang Tri, Da Nang, Hue, and An Lui, which is where some of the most fierce battles of this conflict took place. And of course, the B-52 bombers dropping what I thought were the cluster bombs. These are the C-123s that were used by the Air Force to drop the herbicide. The issue, again, with these planes is not only did they contaminate the land and the people during the conflict, but they have continued the devastation to the children of American servicemen and women who were in Vietnam, as well as to the Vietnamese. This is what the land looked like after the spraying mission, and it's important to understand that it was not just dropped from planes. Agent Orange dioxin was sprayed from backpacks, from the canisters that you see. The troops were told that it was not harmful. You can see a young guy sitting next to it. The barrels in which the Agent Orange was contained had an orange stripe around it. When it was emptied, the guys would use it for showers and for barbecue pits. And this is what the mangrove forest looked like after the use of the herbicide. I'm sure some of you have heard about the massacre at My Lai, 1965. This is just one of the most startling pictures, I think, of what went on. This was a village, a hamlet, where there were about 500 children and women who lived. The American soldiers went into this hamlet and they tortured and killed every living being that they could find. It's a story told by Hugh Thompson, who was an American helicopter pilot who flew into the middle of this and saw what was going on and told the American troops they had to stop. and told his gunner that if they didn't stop, they would shoot at the Americans. And think about this, 500 Vietnamese. Hugh Thompson tells this story in a BBC interview, and what he said was, what was so terrible was that the people were tortured before they were killed. And I just want to say to you all, I've been to Vietnam a number of times and spoken with people, and one of the statements a friend said to me was, we understand there was a war going on, but did the Americans have to be so cruel? And I would say to you today that when we identify people as the other and as the enemy, that's what we teach our soldiers. In 1964, President Johnson made it possible for the United States to drop napalm all over the country of South Vietnam. Napalm has only one purpose. It sticks to the skin and it burns. And you see the very famous photograph of the young girl running away from the napalm. Remember that in the 1920s, at the end of the First World War, the Geneva Conventions made it illegal to use chemical warfare against people, and yet we used it in Vietnam. We've talked a little bit before about the impact also on the American troops, on the soldiers, the young guys who were drafted, and what they went through. This is a very famous photograph on the cover of Life magazine. These pictures were in everybody's home every night, so it was impossible not to know what was going on in Vietnam. And this is a picture of the wall at the bottom photograph. The wall in Washington, D.C., that has the names of 58,200 American soldiers on it. And think again about how big this wall would be if it had 4 million names on it. 4 million names. And this is the way the United States left Vietnam. April 30th, 1975. Not that difficult to get out, right? So what I'd like to mention to you tonight is the lasting legacy of the American war in Vietnam, and show you pictures of a Vietnamese soldier who is a bilateral amputee, a picture of 2 children who have been wounded recently in Quang Tri province, that was one of the most heavily bombed areas of the Vietnam conflict. This is recent because all those unexploded ordnances are still in the ground. And the middle picture is a picture of a young man at my hospital, at Oak Knoll Naval Hospital. You look at their wounds and you can see the similarities of what war does to people. And these are the bombs, some of the bombs that we dropped. Take a look at them. These are called anti-personnel weapons. And they're anti-personnel weapons because as the bombs are being dropped, they explode in midair. And they send thousands of pieces of shrapnel into anything that is around. The purpose is to kill. The purpose is to destroy the enemy and to force the enemy to use their resources to take care of the wounded. These bombs, these cluster bombs, have just recently been dug up from Quang Tri province. So the impact of the American war in Vietnam continues. It continues with these unexploded bombs. It continues in, this is Al Lui province. The bomb craters are still there. You can see what the land continues to look like. And the next picture is a child from Vietnam that was sent to me in 1972 by the Vietnamese, who said, look at what Agent Orange is doing to our children and to our babies. So we knew a long time ago that there was this impact. This is a young man who lives in one of the places we visited who has autism, who was born like this as a result of his father's exposure to the herbicide. You can see that he has autism, he's got cerebral palsy, he will never get better. This is a young man, and please look at him. When I saw him, I thought, oh my goodness, this is a child, right? About a 2-year-old child. He is 37 years old in this picture. 37 years old. His father was exposed to the Agent Orange, came back, Mama became pregnant, and they had this child. She lives in a one-room hut, and she provides food because there's a rice paddy right outside her house. This child we just saw about 4 years ago when our group went to Vietnam to take a look at the impact of the Agent Orange. Her sister takes care of her. These are kids, young babies, in an orphanage right outside of Ho Chi Minh City. Our suspicion is that the mothers got impacted from the Agent Orange dioxin because of the land, because the dioxin stays in the fatty tissues of the body, and when mama breastfeeds the babies, they can transmit the impact on the cells. We talked today about reconciliation regarding the war and the issues that go on. I'd like to introduce you to Heather Bowser, who is the daughter of an American serviceman who served in Vietnam. She was born missing a leg, as you can see. Her fingers are fused. She goes to Vietnam to meet with the children and with the Vietnamese who were also harmed by the use of the Agent Orange. This young man has identical birth defects to what Heather had. It's kind of a remarkable story. And today, we talk about reconciliation between former enemies. So I'm just going to mention to you that one of the major campaigns I work on is the Vietnam Agent Orange Relief and Responsibility Campaign, and we are working on healing the wounds of war, on reconciling former enemies, and working on providing services for those who have been harmed by our government's intervention in Vietnam. And I would say again that it is incumbent on all of us to understand what the government does because we allow it to go on. We have a responsibility to stop in the name of peace and social justice. And this is Da Nang today, Da Nang Harbor, where there was once a Marine base. Today, there's a peaceful statue overlooking the harbor. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Let me just say, Susan mentioned the Geneva Accords that was signed after the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu. And as a result of the Geneva Accords, Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel temporarily for people just to find their most comfortable spot where they wanted to live, north or south. And the stipulation in the Geneva Accords was that in 2 years there would be a national election from which Vietnam would be united. There was no such thing as South Vietnam at the time. It's a creation of the United States. There was no nation, South Vietnam. When the 2 years were up, the United States had already created a puppet government and had supplied this government with one of the largest militaries in the world, with equipment and training, and together with its allies, refused to allow the national unification election to occur. That's democracy. We are for democracy. What is wrong with having a national election? The Vietnamese had been waiting for unification for hundreds of years, and they were denied it as a result of United States intervention. As Susan mentioned, the fear was, of course, that Ho Chi Minh was so popular after his his defeat of the French, that he would be elected as president, and the United States was worried that democracy is good as long as the president is our person and not someone who we can't control. Ho Chi Minh was predominantly a nationalist, although we constantly characterize him still today as being a communist. Was a member of the Communist Party, but was predominantly a nationalist. The other clarification I'd like to say is that as a result of this fictitious Gulf of Tonkin incident that took place, the first incident did actually occur in which one bullet actually hit the Maddox. And the next day, the Maddox and the Turner Joy came back into the Gulf of Tonkin, and it was alleged they were attacked again by Vietnamese torpedo boats, and everyone realizes that that event never happened. We know that Johnson knew about that from his tapes, his secret tapes, which have been released. He talks about the service, the Navy personnel as shooting at flying fish. But as a result of that fictitious event, Congress rushed through the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, much like we rushed through the Iraq resolution after 9/11. And as a result of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, Congress abdicated its power under the Constitution to declare war and created an imperial presidency and empowered him with the power to conduct and create war at wherever he saw fit. As a result, the intensive bombing of the North began, and soon afterwards, Marines landed at Da Nang. I would now like to attempt to Skype with Chuck Palazzo. Chuck is, let me see if I can get this to work. Chuck now lives in Da Nang, and it's kind of early in Da Nang right now. I think it's about 7 o'clock. Let's see if I can, how do I do this? I'll hit Skype, hit Chuck. Gotcha. Let's see if we can get him. Chuck Palazzo served as a reconnaissance Marine during the Vietnam War from 1970 to 71, and now lives in Da Nang, Vietnam. Chuck returned to Vietnam for the first time. Chuck!
Hey, good morning, Mac.
Hey, how you doing, Chuck?
I'm great. How are you?
Okay, how's the weather there?
It's about 72 and a little bit cloudy.
Oh, I'm glad we're here. Well, it's kind of early in the morning by you, right?
Yeah, it's just shy of 7 a.m.
Oh, well, thank you for getting up and talking with us. Let me just finish your introduction here. So Chuck returned to Vietnam for the first time in 2001 in an attempt to deal with post-traumatic stress disorder from which he was suffering. And in 2008, he decided to move his information technology business to Vietnam and worked on behalf of Agent Orange victims. Chuck is now living there full-time and doing okay. We want to conduct this as a question and answer. Is that okay with you, Chuck?
Yeah, absolutely, Mac, sure.
Okay, why don't we begin by maybe you can talk to us a little bit about your, when did you first go to Vietnam, and how old were you and what'd you do and all that?
Yeah, I enlisted in the Marine Corps when I was 17 years old, and had absolutely nothing to do with politics or the war. It was, in my mind, it was my ticket out of New York, if you will. And a year later, I found myself in Vietnam. I was 18 years old. I had just turned 18, and found myself landing in Da Nang, and was based with a reconnaissance battalion just outside of Da Nang for 13 months.
Yeah. Well, you were, you know, I know when I went over to Vietnam as a Marine, I was kind of a gung-ho guy, at least for about the first week. And then I started to realize reality. What was your feelings about the war before you went, while you were there, and did you have any changes of ideas?
Well, I really had no political aspirations, no political knowledge before I got here. My knowledge of the war at that time, you know, during the mid and late '60s, was watching Walter Cronkite and the newsreels once a week, or it became nightly events on the news. And I really had no idea what it was all about, and to be honest, I had different things going on in my life, so I really wasn't so concerned about it. Growing up in New York and specifically in the Bronx, as I said earlier, I was really looking for a way out, and the Marine Corps gave me that. My political knowledge and my knowledge of the war and you know, the moment that I said, oh my God, what did I do? And oh my God, I'm involved in a war, was when I landed here in Da Nang in 1970. It was a flight that landed here at Da Nang. It was at the military field at the time. Now it's the International Airport. But the tarmac was literally lined up with caskets on either side of Americans who had been killed in action going back to the U.S. So it was at that moment that I realized I was actually becoming involved in a war.
Yeah, I had the same kind of realization and smell the reality of war. What were how did you feel about what you were asked to do and the way you were asked to do it?
Well, after about a week, I went on my first mission up here in the mountains, and I witnessed firsthand my first contact with the quote-unquote enemy, if you will. I quickly realized and decided a few things. What we were doing here in Vietnam was wrong politically. It took me very short order to understand that and realize that. You know, why should we try to influence the Vietnamese in what's going on in their country? So I started becoming anti-war and anti-U.S. government policy while I was here very early on. And it quickly became a matter of survival for me. I decided again very early on that, you know, I'm gonna get out of this thing in one piece. Hopefully the stars are shining on me the right way, and I'm gonna do as little damage as possible to others, just to get out of here and save my own butt, to be honest.
Yeah, I think anyone who's been in country or been in a war realizes that no one who is there is fighting for God and country and ideology. Everyone is just struggling to stay alive and get the hell out of there and get home. Especially with our war, we knew exactly that, you know, our tours were 13 months in the Marine Corps, and we knew exactly when we were going home for the time, you know, the DEROS, we knew exactly when we were coming home for the time we got there. So the main thing was to survive. When did you first go back to Vietnam, Chuck?
I first came back in 2001. I had been dealing with a lot of things up until then, and namely and specifically PTSD was a big factor in my life, and certainly a big factor and a reason why I came back here. I'm often asked, you know, why did I come back to Vietnam at all? Is it because I'm an activist on behalf of the Agent Orange victims and all of that? And you know, to be honest with you, the reason I came back was a selfish one. Originally, it was to confront my own demons and my own ghosts. I had been advised by several, hey, get back there, get back to Vietnam and understand what Vietnam is really about. Understand who the Vietnamese people are. And the forgiveness that you will experience is an incredible healing process. And I've learned over the last 8 years since I've been living here that is absolutely the case. Vietnam is a wonderful country. The Vietnamese people are wonderful people. But that goal or that mission back in 2001 quickly changed. I started getting involved with the Agent Orange victims here in Vietnam, first with the Vietnamese Red Cross, and later with an organization known as the Vietnam Association for Victims of Agent Orange and Dioxin. And I quickly, I realized how bad the Agent Orange problem was and continues to be here in Vietnam. And it had occurred to me that, through our battles, Mac, you and me and the rest of us back in the U.S., it took us a while, and we still don't receive enough, but we get something from our Department of Veterans Association. We get some help, we get some disability because of our Agent Orange exposure if we're disabled. But the Vietnamese have gotten nothing. Just recently there is a trickle of money that's coming in from the U.S. government to remediate the environment, especially here in Da Nang. And some money is coming over as to resolve some of the people with disabilities. And just recently, the United States is changing the verbiage. Instead of excluding Agent Orange victims, they're now allowing such verbiage as not to exclude victims of Agent Orange in their grants. So very, very, very happy to see that happening. But I got involved and, realizing that there just was not enough focus. There's so many people that don't know how bad the problem is in Vietnam and how bad it continues to be. And I took it on as a mission, if you will, to help spread the word, bring attention to the problem, and do what
of Agent Orange exposure and its legacy, right? Is that what you're talking about?
Absolutely, the problem of Agent Orange exposure and legacy, and now that we're well into the third generation of the effects of Agent Orange, and closely approaching the fourth generation of effects of Agent Orange here in Vietnam and back in the United States, I might add.
Do you think that the United States has more of a responsibility, a responsibility to do more? Are we doing what we should do? I know when the peace treaty was signed between Kissinger and Lee Duc-Tho, we had agreed to pay billions in reparations to Vietnam, and I understand that money never did come to Vietnam. So do you think that the United States should be doing more? And what about Monsanto and Dow, the people who made it?
Yeah, Mac, you're absolutely right. The reparations that Nixon and Kissinger promised during the Paris peace talks never happened. The United States reneged on that deal, and Vietnam never received any of that money. The United States is not doing enough for the victims of the remnants of our war, I'll call it, namely Agent Orange and the unexploded ordnance problem. Just to touch on the unexploded ordnance problem for a second, Vietnam was the most heavily bombed country in the world. More tonnage of bombs were dropped in Vietnam than in all of World War II. And many people don't realize that. But yeah, getting back to Agent Orange, the United States has done very, very little. And it's only been in recent years that a trickle of money is coming in. And as I said earlier, the United States government is very, very careful in how they word, the documentation and the grants, et cetera, of the money that's coming to Vietnam. They're very, very careful. And my guess and my speculation is they don't want to open up the floodgates, for liabilities and that kind of thing. That's my guess, and I'm not an attorney and I'm not a scientist.
Right.
Your point, Mac, about the manufacturers of Agent Orange, especially Monsanto and Dow and some of the others, they have given absolutely zero, nothing at all to the Vietnamese. Yes, you and I, we were all part of a settlement back in the U.S. during the 80s. Monsanto and all the rest of the manufacturers of Agent Orange never admitted any guilt, but they decided to settle with the American veteran. And of course,
the lawyers got most of the money, by the way.
Absolutely, absolutely, as usual.
Yeah.
But the sad irony, Mac, if I will, is Monsanto happens to be the largest manufacturer of genetically modified seeds and organisms throughout the world today, and they have the audacity to come back to Vietnam, open up a couple of offices, conduct field trials, along with the approval of the Vietnamese government, I might add.
My God.
And just recently, over the last couple of weeks, several strains of genetically modified corn have been approved for commercial use in Vietnam. And many folks don't realize that there are many flavors, literally, of genetically modified stuff. But these specific corn strains that have been approved in Vietnam have components in them that are very similar to the chemical structure and makeup of Agent Orange. In addition to that, they have been genetically modified in a way to withstand megadoses of herbicides such as Roundup. So what that really means is the farmer can grow his corn stalks, corn plants, and saturate the plant and the surrounding ground with a product like Roundup, which is glyphosate. And just as recent as a couple of days ago, the World Health Organization has stated glyphosate does indeed cause cancer. So it's a terrible irony that Monsanto is back here, and this whole genetically modified problem is a big problem.
Yeah, I guess crime does pay.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about, kind of a personal question about you. You decided at some point that, you visited a few times, I guess, and then you decided that you were going to move there permanently. What made you decide to do that?
Well, there were a couple of things, Mac. I became very, very heavily involved in the work that I was doing with the victims of Agent Orange in Vietnam. And I was also running a software development business in the U.S. So I had the business opportunity to kind of shuttle back and forth and pay the bills, if you will, through that software company, and also doing software development work here in Vietnam. And it allowed me to become closer and get more involved with the victims of Agent Orange in Vietnam. 8 years ago, all of the stars kind of lined up the right way. And as a result of the business and as a result of further involvement with organizations like VAVA here in Vietnam, I decided to just make the move and commit the rest of my life to helping the victims of Agent Orange here in Vietnam.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. I understand you also live in a pretty nice place. You mentioned to me once that you live a few minutes from China Beach, which I remember pretty well myself. I've been there a few days. Kind of a nice place to be. So, I mean, any regrets about anything? Regrets about being in the war? Regrets about what we did? Or regrets about anything?
Well, as I said earlier, Mac, I still suffer from PTSD.
Yeah.
As you know, it never goes away. We're never healed. We learn to live with it. We cope with it, et cetera. My regret, if any, is that I was part of the military machine responsible for all of the harm and destruction and death that continues to this day in Vietnam.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's something we have to live with for the rest of our lives. Yeah. Yeah.
It is. If we had a crystal ball in front of us at 17 and 18 years old, I think maybe our choices would have been a bit different.
Yeah, I don't know. I was so stupid at the time that no one could have convinced me not to become involved. I was just too brainwashed, I think, and I had to learn from myself that Italian skull. I don't know what to do with it. You know what? While we got you on the line here, maybe we can open it up for questions from the audience. And would you be amenable to that? Would you like to converse with the audience?
Yeah, absolutely.
Does anyone have any? Okay, way in the back. Go ahead.
All right. So my question was,
Loud, please.
it's like a two-part question. First is, did you visit the Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C.?
Did you hear him, Chuck?
No, I didn't, Matt.
Okay, he asked have you ever visited the Vet Memorial, the wall, I guess, in Washington, D.C.?
I did, and it took me a number of years to actually get down there and see it. I've been there only once. It's obviously a very impressive monument and memorial, but it's also a very devastating experience, if you will. As I walked, across the wall there and started seeing names of my buddies who were killed here, a bad experience.
Yeah, I remember when it was.
I've never returned. I only went there once.
Yeah, I remember when it was first built, I refused to go. I was invited to go to the dedication ceremony, and I refused to go because I looked at it as another attempt to mythologize the war. But I was wrong about the wall because the wall, I've taken a number of groups there, veteran groups who were suffering from post-traumatic stress. And like you said, it's a very difficult place, and I think a very healing place for us to go. I sometimes wonder, after we're all gone, whether or not the memorial is going to maintain its sense of sacredness, or it's just going to evolve into another, just another generic war memorial, you know.
Well, Mac, I agree with you, and I hope it does preserve that sacredness. I think some of the other projects associated with the wall might interfere with that sacredness. Some of the museums they're talking about and spending millions and millions more for that kind of stuff. I think the wall of itself, in and of itself, is enough. And it is a beautiful piece of art as well.
Yes, yes. And we remember the controversy when they first designed it and dedicated it. Many Vietnam veterans thought it wasn't warlike enough, and that's kind of why they dedicated the three-man statue to placate the people who wanted a better war memorial. Anyone else have a question?
Hi, Chuck. Can you hear me?
Hello. Good morning.
Hi. My name is Sarah. I'm a veteran of the war in Somalia, and I'm quite familiar with PTSD. I'm very intrigued with the idea of going back. That's not possible at this point, 20 years later for myself, but I'm wondering for you, when you went back all these years later, did that bring any sort of sense of relief? I know that PTSD doesn't go away, but did it take any of the pressure off of, that pressure cooker that is PTSD in any way? I'm sure it was very triggering initially.
No, if you
Okay,
wouldn't mind.
she's wondering whether or not going back was a kind of curative or healing for you to experience.
Like with
back.
your
I know
PTSD
I had a number of
symptoms.
opportunities to go back, and I'm not brave enough to do it. I just can't imagine going back and visiting those places and remembering what happened in those places. So for me, I don't know. Maybe one day I'll get brave enough to come and have a drink with you. But she was wondering, did you find it curative, a healing for you to go back?
Yes, and it continues to be. It absolutely is an ongoing process. A very quick story. When I first landed in 2001, I landed in Hanoi, and I was almost frozen in fear getting off the airplane. I imagined the Vietnamese immigration folks having my name on some database. There's that Marine that was here in 1970.
No, that's us. We do that. We have the database.
But it was not the case at all, and that was really my, that's probably one of my favorite stories because it's indicative of how the Vietnamese people are. The immigration fellow, a big smile on his face. He welcomed me to Hanoi, welcomed me to Vietnam, and that just started a series of interactions with the Vietnamese people. Ever since I've lived here, I've purposely chosen to live in Vietnamese neighborhoods where I'm the only Westerner around. And I do that for a number of reasons, but mainly to get closer to the Vietnamese and understand their cultures and their society as best as I can, and especially their ability and their capacity to forgive. It's just incredible. There's absolutely no animosity at all towards me. I might not say the same about the animosity towards our U.S. military and the government, but to us personally, they hold absolutely nothing against us. It's just incredible. I visited My Lai, and I did a story down there several years ago, and I met some of the survivors of the families that were murdered and slaughtered during the My Lai massacre. And some of the survivors who had been, 10, 11, 12 years old at the time, they saw how upset I was. I was visibly shaken when I went down there. And they got me on the side and said, through an interpreter, you need to forgive yourself because we've forgiven you long ago.
Wow.
And it's just incredible. It's amazing, you know. And that's really been the way it's been, you know, for the last 8 years that I've been here. So yes.
You've been there 8 years now, Chuck, living full-time?
Yeah, 8 years full-time now.
Wow. Wow. And I think that's so important that we have to learn to forgive ourselves, you know, because it's all about what we carry and what we have, yeah. Any other questions for Chuck? Yes, sir. Hang on, we're getting the mic.
Sure.
Yeah, there's a number of people from
Could
the
you
Bronx.
speak out, Terry, so
Hello?
maybe Chuck can hear you? Okay.
It's on? It's on?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, there's a number of people from the Bronx in the audience here, and we're probably curious about where'd you grow up in the Bronx and what neighborhoods.
We got some
what
Bronx
neighborhoods
folks
you-
here. They
Very
wanna know.
proud to have a Bronx.
I hear the Bronx cheer.
Where'd you grow up in the Bronx, Chuck? You want to know?
I grew up on Arthur Avenue, right around the
Oh, well,
corner.
there you go. The Italian neighborhood, yeah. We have a lot of Arthur Avenue people here. There's a question back there.
First of all, thank you for your service. Can you hear me?
Can
you hear
Chuck,
me?
can you hear him?
Hello?
Not clearly, Mac.
Okay.
Hello,
I can
hello.
repeat
Is this
it if-
working? Okay.
Yeah, it's working.
Okay. First of all, thank you for your service. And I'm just curious. Obviously, you went back to Vietnam to have some kind of a healing aspect in your life, and I certainly understand that. And you were in Vietnam pretty much after the height of the war, not to diminish anything that you experienced. However, because you were a draftee, if I'm correct.
Were you drafted, Chuck?
No,
He
no,
was
I
a Marine.
enlisted.
Most Marines, there were some Marine draftees, but most Marines were enlisted.
Really, during that time, there was a draft.
It was a draft, but not into the Marines. I think at one point it was like 1 out of every 10 went into
Oh,
the
okay.
Marines. But the vast majority weren't. The vast majority of
I
Marines
take
were
that back.
volunteers.
But
That's correct.
like you, I was a Marine. I was there in Way City in 1968. I'm just curious, the fact that you're there and dealing with all the post side of Vietnam and so forth. What is your position on young men and women now joining the military for just another false war that we're getting involved in, whether you're anti-military or what do you have? What's your message to these young people who are kind of lured into the military because of the monetary gains for college or whatever and so forth, which maybe they would not have had unless they went to the military?
Yes, basically the question is, do you have any feelings about how what's going on now with the young Marines and the young people in America who are now, I'm going to use this word, being lured into the military in order to fight this war after your experiences and the lessons that you learned and we all learned? How do you feel about that? Do you have any?
Yeah, I feel very strongly, and I wish there was a way that all of us can somehow counter the propaganda that comes out of the U.S. military and the U.S. government to lure the youth of today into the military. In saying that, however, I also believe very strongly that the U.S. government needs to come up with some similar, not a similar program, but some kind of training program to offer the youth of today an alternative. School might not be the right thing for many of the youth. It was not the right thing for me at the time. And that's one of the reasons why I joined the Marines. But my message to the youth of today would be absolutely stay out of the military. Don't get involved.
Yeah.
Don't believe the lies.
Yes, yes, yes. And it's not that you, it's not that you're anti-military per se. It's that you're anti-immoral war and unnecessary war and endless war and perpetual war for corporate profit. And I can understand that because I don't feel I'm anti-military. I do a lot of work with recruiting, but I never call it anti-recruiting. I call it truth in recruiting because no one was going to tell me not to enlist when I enlisted. But and that's okay. But at least people have to go in knowing what it's like and knowing what the reality is and knowing what they're going to experience. I had a kid tell me once, I'm going in to join because he saw a tattoo on my arm, a Marine Corps tattoo. He said, I'm going in because I want to get a tattoo like that that's cool, the chicks love it. So this is why this young 17-year-old is going to join the Marine. Let's take one more question, and then we have to move on. Chuck, I wish we could talk the whole time. Yes, sir.
Hi, I just have.
Just yell. I can.
Okay. All right. Thanks. All right. I just have one question. How do you communicate with the victims of Agent Orange? Because I'm Vietnamese, and as far as I know, those people speak a little, if not, they don't really speak English.
Yeah. Have you picked up any of the language, Chuck? Do you speak Vietnamese at all?
Very, very little. Choop, 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 as they say here. Very, very little.
and so the question was, how do you communicate with the people that you work with or even live with, or live around?
Many of the younger generation are required to take English in school. And recently, the Vietnamese government has, I think, unofficially mandated that their management levels, middle management above, learn the English language. So it's a rather easy country to communicate in, and it's a rather easy group of people to communicate with as well.
Right.
It's funny, I've got neighbors that speak absolutely no English, and with my pig Vietnamese, I'll call it that, we can communicate. Communication is a wonderful thing. It's not all about language.
Yeah. It's not all about language. I want to thank Chuck, and maybe you can join me in thanking Chuck for getting up really early. Chuck, take care, brother.
Go Yankees.
Say again?
Go Yankees.
Oh, Yankees. Oh, God. We'll talk soon.
Thanks, Mac.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
I'll be talking to you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Chuck. It was great, wasn't he? I wish we can, maybe sometime we'll do it again when we talk to him for more time. Now, I know we probably went over with that, but, we really had an opportunity to. I'm really pleased to have with us to further clarify the experience and from another perspective. It's Do Hung Viet, and Viet is the Deputy Permanent Representative of Vietnam to the United Nations. Viet previously served at the Department of International Organization of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Vietnam, where he was responsible for Vietnam's cooperation with the United Nations, as well as issues on disarmament, and on the disposal of explosive remnants of war. He holds a bachelor's degree in international relations from the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam and a master's of international law from the University of Melbourne. Please join me in welcoming Viet. Put the lights on you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a great honor for me to be here today, and I would like, first of all, to thank the organizers for holding this event. I mean, it's a very opportune time for us to, again, talk about this issue. It's a 40th commemoration of the end of the war. It's a 70th anniversary of the independence of our country, of Vietnam, back in 1945. And it's also 20 years anniversary of the normalization of relations between Vietnam and the US after the end of the war. So it's indeed a great honor for me and extremely humbling to be among Susan and all the other speakers, Chuck, and so many veterans here today. When I was asked to come and speak and to share my experience of the war, I was a little bit mortified. I was born in 1977, so 2 years after the war. What experience do I have? And you will probably ask the same question. What is this young guy doing here? But then I thought, no, for every single Vietnamese, there is an experience. It's either a direct experience or it's an experience that you have in your family, in your village, in your town, at school, everywhere you go, basically. So let me tell you a little bit my own experience. As I said, I was fortunate to be born after the war, but I grew up with memories of the war surrounding me. My first experience was probably the time of course I was there many times before, but the times that I first realized that there was a wall in my grandpa's house where there were a lot of decorations and honors and medals for the heroism during the wars. And one stood out to me. That one said, "The fatherland's recognition of sacrifice." And that was for my uncle, my father's younger brother. He was a soldier. He was killed during the war, and his remains have never been found. That is not something too special. We can find a lot of those walls, a lot of those in the homes of the Vietnamese anywhere you go. And you can also, as you travel throughout the country, you see a lot of memorials too. One that I visited really stood out, again, was the one in Quảng Trị province. Susan, you may have been there. It's a cemetery in the Trường Sơn area, which is a 35-acre area of land where 10,000 Vietnamese soldiers are arrested. So it's an incredible experience to be there and to really kind of relive the horror of the war that those people had to go through. I also grew up with stories that my parents told me about the war, about how they would run for cover whenever there was an alarm that, the planes are coming, the bombers are coming. I also heard stories about how my mom was always so scared of full moon nights, because on one of those nights, her mother, my grandmother, was killed in a bombing raid at Ham Rong Bridge in Thanh Hóa province. It was also stories that my dad told me about the years he studied and worked at the Vietnamese embassy in Sweden, and how he witnessed the late Prime Minister Olof Palme taking to the streets with so many Swedish and international friends in protest of the war. And also the particular story that he cannot stop talking about the time he learned about the end of the war on 30th April 1975 through Swedish radio, and how the kind of outburst of emotion of himself and everyone else in the embassy on that special day. But again, these kind of stories are things that most of my friends would have heard from their parents or grandparents. I have with me today a young colleague from the Mission of Vietnam, whose name happens to be Nam, and my name is Viet, so we have Viet and Nam in the mission. And he is born into a military family, and his parents and grandparents too, right, are all soldiers and currently serving, what parents are currently serving in the Vietnamese army. So I don't think these kind of stories are anything too unique for a Vietnamese family, but I wanted to share that with you just to share a kind of personal experience that I had. Now, we learned about the war at school. We learned that the war was brought upon us by the US military, like the French before them, who wanted to rule our land and our people, to decide our fate for us. And we learned that the war that we had to fight was the war against foreign aggression, a war for national liberation, and a war for reunification of our country. That was what the war meant to us, and for the generation that is born after the war ended. It was the sacrifice of the millions of our Vietnamese fellows that brought us the peace that we enjoy today. You may know very well about the history of our country, but somehow we are so unfortunate that we had been through centuries the subject of conquer of so many forces. We have the centuries of the Mongols, the Chinese, then the French, and then the United States. The end of the war meant that we finally were independent, united, and it put a complete and total end to the century of colonial rule on our land, and it really ushered a new era of independence and freedom for our whole nation. So what was it that really helped bring an end to this devastating war, and for Vietnam to regain its independence and reunification? I don't think it would be wise for me to really attempt to list all the factors, but let me just focus on probably two or three things. The first is the righteousness of our struggle. It was a struggle against foreign aggression. It was a struggle for our own national salvation, and it was a struggle for our independence and freedom. The second factor is the resolve of the Vietnamese people, the kind of determination that we have shown throughout the centuries that we have been victims of wars, and the unity of the entire nation. We all shared the same goal, and the millions of people of Vietnam acted and fought as one in this very fight against aggression. The third, of course, were the right and wise strategies, the military, the political, the diplomatic strategies that we had in place, and of course all the people who carried them out. And importantly, we had the support from other countries, from friends around the world. And we had this international solidarity movement against the war. And finally, and extremely importantly, the anti-war movement here in the United States that many of you were part of was an extremely important factor forcing the administrations to put an end to the war. And here I think it's important to state that it has always been very clear to us from the days I was in school, and I believe now too in schools, there is always a very clear distinction between the people of America and those who came to the war in Vietnam, not physically coming, but the administration. There is always a very clear distinction between the administration, the decision makers, and the people of America. We will, I think, probably hear some poems from Jan and Bill later today. But on this particular point, I wanted to quote one of the best-known poets of Vietnam, Tô Hữu, who wrote about Norman Morrison after his self-immolation in protest of the war in Vietnam. And it's called Emily, My Daughter, in which he wrote extremely strong words of condemnation about President Johnson, about Secretary of Defense McNamara. But then he continued, and I quote, "Now look at me. At this very moment, me and my little girl, I am today, and you, Emily, you are forever. I rise with the great hearts of the millions Americans to light up the horizon with the light of justice." I think these are just amazing words that spoke very well to the kind of sentiments that the people that were part of the anti-war movement had in their hearts. And we are extremely grateful to all those who have taken to the streets, who have protested in the university campuses, who turned out to the teach-ins 50 years ago today. The voices of conscience of those millions of people did play a crucial part in helping put an end to the war. Now heading towards the future, now that 40 years have passed and we have been moving forward in the spirit of shelving the past in order to head towards the future. The two countries have indeed gone a really long way from being foes to becoming friends, from enemies to becoming very important partners. After 20 years of normalization of relations, the relations have grown so strongly. The US has now become the largest market for Vietnamese exports. A lot of the coffee you drink may have come from Vietnam, the clothes you are wearing, the footwear, the seafood you eat in restaurants, a lot of those may have come from Vietnam. The people-to-people exchange has increased significantly. The number of Vietnamese students has grown from 800 to 16,000 over the last 15 years or so. And I just heard a student from Vietnam being part of that. And as we have heard before, many, many veterans have come back to Vietnam to visit. And I have heard stories, and we just heard again from Chuck, how relieved they were coming into Vietnam. I have heard stories about veterans walking down the street and being greeted and welcomed by the, by the people after realizing that they were American veterans. And last year there was a very special and unique event, historic event indeed, when as part of the Vietnamese president's visit to Vietnam, there was a meeting of veterans from both Vietnam and the United States. They shared memories, they talked about the war, but they also talked about how they would work together to bring a better future. But there are, of course, areas that do need further work that we have just heard from Susan, from Chuck. That is about resolving the legacies of war. And again, I also want to mention the problems of explosive remnants of war and Agent Orange dioxin. We have heard a lot about how devastating dioxin Agent Orange is. And, you can see those victims in the cities, in the countryside, especially near the central part of the country, near Da Nang and Hoi An. And it's really heart-wrenching to see those kids born with deformities as victims of Agent Orange. We also heard about the amounts of bombs and explosive remnants of war. There were 1,600 tons of bomb dropped every day on North Vietnam during that time. About 100 pounds per head is a calculation. And now about 20% of the total land area of Vietnam is still contaminated with unexploded remnants of war. And let me just show you very quickly one map that shows how much contamination there is. For each black dot, there is, contaminated area of land, and you can see how black the whole country is. And it's a humanitarian issue. People get hurt, get mutilated by hitting these unexploded remnants. But it's also a developmental issue too, because you could imagine a farmer not daring to go into his or her field for daily work, only because they don't know if they would be hit by a mine or a bomb during that day. Or for any new construction project, the first thing that we would need to do is to clear the bombs and the mines that may exist there. So that require immense resources for clearance and for helping the victims. So the hope is that we will be able to decontaminate the land, to help the victims, and I just, on that issue, would like to express our really heartfelt gratitude to the many veterans who have been so active in helping those victims and bringing this issue to the attention of the American people. I think I will stop there. I thank you for your kind attention, and I guess there will be a discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you, Viet. One of the reasons why we're doing this, and we feel it's so important to do this, is because we are currently involved in the 50th, the congressionally mandated 50th year commemoration. I say celebration because that's how it's looked at. Of the Vietnam War, and if you go on to the website, to the commemoration site, you'll get the history and a number of other things about the war, at least the Pentagon's version of the history. And unfortunately, we feel that the history of the Vietnam War must be real and must be accurate, and that's what history is, we allege. It has to be real, not just a mythology in order to continue to bait individuals into nationalism and further war. And we think that's what the reason that it is. So we feel that the events like this are necessary so that we can inform and tell the truth about war. Who do I have next? Jan, I think, right? Yes. Jan Barry is a poet and a writer and author of Life After War and Other Poems, and co-editor of Winning Hearts and Minds, War Poems by Vietnam Veterans, among other works. He's a Vietnam veteran. He's active with Combat Paper and Warrior Writers Project. He has curated art exhibitions and poetry readings of works by military veterans at a number of galleries in New Jersey. He teaches journalism at Ramapo College of New Jersey and St. Thomas Aquinas College. Ladies and gentlemen, Jan Barry.
I'm getting more mics. One second here. I have a 10-year-old computer. Okay, so this slideshow is from that older computer. Actually, I like it better.
Want the light on, Jan, or should I?
Can you see it? It's better probably with the light out. I wanted to pull together the history, the art, poetry, but also how to deal with all of this. Some of us it was discovering, which mic? This one? For some of us it was discovering poetry, for other people it was discovering art. I most recently have been discovering art as well, which I will show you in a moment here as soon as I get organized. In a case of a historical overkill, the United States government is celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War, not just this month, but for 13 years. 50 years ago, in March 1965, the big news across America, of course, was that the Marines had landed in Vietnam. For many in the news media, the landing of 2 Marine battalions at Da Nang was the beginning of the U.S. war in Vietnam. There it was, headline in the Chicago Tribune, smaller headline about something happened in Selma, Alabama. A better way to put it is that in 1965, Uncle Sam's secret war in Southeast Asia emerged out of the shadows. In an attempt to provide some historical perspective, the Obama administration began commemorating the 50th anniversary of the war in Vietnam on Memorial Day 2012. Remember that? This means that the Pentagon's official history now says that the war started in 1962. Having arrived in Vietnam in December 1962 to report to an Army aviation unit that flew Special Forces teams on secret missions, I'm curious to know exactly when did the war start? Here's some of my artwork. I was there so early that when I came back to the States, other people in the military joked that I was on vacation. So here's my rendition of being on vacation in Vietnam at dawn with the planes coming in. Actually, they were taking off in the airfield just behind this viewpoint, going on their missions. By the time I arrived, the U.S. government had implemented a memo circulated to the Pentagon in January 1962 that proposed developing a suitable cover story for our escalating military operations in Vietnam, in the words of Deputy Secretary of Defense Roswell Gilpatrick. Thanks to the internet, we can read that memo today when I couldn't have found it at that time when I was in the military. And here's the key quote: recommend a suitable cover story or stories, a public explanation, a statement of no comment, or an appropriate combination thereof for approval by the Secretary of Defense. This recommendation will cover the initial call-up and movement of forces or material concerned to the area of operations and their subsequent employment. This cover story, maintained for years, was that the U.S. military units were not engaged in combat, but were, quote, advisors to the South Vietnamese military. Well, here's one of the uniforms. Here's an entire book published sometime afterwards that shows in the fine print that it started actually in 1957, this kind of uniform, military advisory groups as an example. Well, the uniforms also evolved into more chic camis, tiger camis, but then there's the standard OD green. This is Stars and Stripes. Can you read the date? April 11th, 1962. 2 Special Forces sergeants were killed and 2 were missing in action. April 1962. See that date? January 4th, 1963. By that time, I was a young, still 19-year-old GI in Vietnam. Big battle. Helicopters, troops, 3 Americans were killed. Big headline. Saturday Evening Post. Can you read it? March 2nd, 1963. Whoa, what happened to the advisors? The subhead says a powerful account of GIs in a lonely, bloody war. I don't even remember seeing that issue. It wasn't available in Vietnam. Here was Herblock, cartoon. Washington Post, 1962. Making clearly the political cartoon comment that we were in for trouble. Quote, advisors, those official twists of semantics are still being used in Iraq and Afghanistan as cover stories for secretive combat missions by U.S. forces. Indeed, much of what the U.S. government did after getting militarily involved in Southeast Asia in the 1940s is still taking place as secretive official policies. Despite the fancy proclamation signed by President Obama in 2012, the cover-up of the falsehoods of the Vietnam War and disastrous aftermath continues. Obama's proclamation of the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War states that, you can look it up online also, in recognition of a chapter of our nation's history that must never be forgotten, let us renew our sacred commitment to those who answered their country's call in Vietnam by staging, quote, a 13-year program to honor and give thanks to a generation of proud Americans who saw our country through one of the most challenging missions we have ever faced. I'll be 80-something by the time they finish this thing. How cruel these words must sound to the ghosts of tens of thousands of Vietnam veterans who died of suicide, drug overdoses, cancer, and other illnesses likely caused by exposure to Agent Orange and other toxic chemicals used in the war, who ended up homeless, imprisoned, beset by post-traumatic stress disorder and other disorienting illnesses that for decades the United States government denied acknowledgement of or treatment for. For a great many Vietnam veterans, their treatment at home by government agencies was worse than what we endured in the war zones. That's not what the Obama administration is calling attention to in this 13-year public relations campaign to tidy up the horrendous history of the Vietnam War. Across the country, veterans, both military and civilian, of the Vietnam peace movement are organizing teach-ins such as we're doing here today and other educational actions to challenge the Pentagon's multi-million-dollar propaganda campaign, which Obama inexplicably endorsed. Apparently, our Nobel Peace Prize laureate president never read what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said about the disasters of the Vietnam War being visited upon Americans at home. Quote, the time has come for America to hear the truth about this tragic war, King said in a widely quoted sermon in April 1967 here in New York City and in other places as well. Quote, perhaps the more tragic recognition of reality took place when it became clear to me that the war was doing far more than devastating the hope of the poor at home, meaning that it had destroyed the campaign to assist people. It was sending their sons and their brothers and their husbands to fight and die in an extraordinarily high proportion relative to the rest of the population. We were taking the black young men who had been crippled by society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem, King continued. So we have been repeatedly faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same schoolroom. Perhaps by the time this Vietnam War camouflage campaign winds up in 2025, the next president or two will have learned something about how to truly honor real work for peace and justice in Vietnam at home and around the world. Meanwhile, veterans of the war in Vietnam are still dealing with the secrets our government didn't want to share with the American people. This is what happened to one of our airplanes in my unit that crashed in the mountains carrying a group of people in special forces on a mission, killed the pilot, and several of us were standing there looking at the complete miracle that the pilot was killed on one side of that front wreckage. The co-pilot stepped out into the jungle on the other side and promptly resigned from his career. I'm learning how to do painting, and I wanted to acknowledge someone who I don't think quite made it. I've been learning to paint at the Secaucus, New Jersey Vet Center Art Group. One of my art mentors is Frank Wagner, who served in the Army in Vietnam not only 50 years ago. He was there in the fall of '64 before the Marines ever got organized to go there. And then he studied here at the School of Visual Arts. We teach each other, we help each other, learn various techniques. I help with writing programs through a group called Warrior Writers. The very first watercolor I did was trying to convey how hard it was to find an airplane when it crashed in the mountains, particularly in the monsoon season. Do you see the little tiny whiff of smoke in the second set of ridges? Some of the planes they never found, some of the crews they never found. I started writing poetry and helping to put together the first anthology of poetry by Vietnam veterans called Winning Hearts and Minds, and this was one of the poems in that book, which I wrote in the winter of either December 71 to January 72, as we were putting the anthology together. The longest war is over, or so they say again, but I can still hear the gunfire every night from my bed. The longest nightmare never seems to ever quite come to an end. As you can see, there is a picture of the wall in Washington, which finally became an official U.S. stamp. Originally, nobody in official Washington wanted to have that memorial, so veterans did it themselves. This is a quote: "Vietnam is filled with angry ghosts, killed violently, buried without ritual, spirits roam resentfully," notes a BBC documentary called Wandering Souls about American veterans returning to Vietnam, quote, "haunted by ghosts of their own," end of quote, to try to help find the places where Vietnamese our military operations killed may still remain. I like to go kayaking and canoeing sometimes in remote places, and quite often I would feel as though there was somebody immediately over my shoulder in another boat, keeping time with me, a Vietnamese ghostly kind of person. This is a poem from a piece of artwork that's a part of combat paper in which military uniforms are cut up and turned into a certain kind of paper you can do art on. And this is the beginning of a somewhat longer poem called Cost of War. Legless, armless, homeless veterans, dead civilians in the millions, orphans, widows, shattered families from blasted cities, ghostly villages full of ghastly graves, in the ruins, ditches, fields. Drew Cameron, who was an Army veteran of Iraq, was the person who taught me how to do that kind of artwork. So we still have bad days even when we're doing artwork. There was an event up the Hudson maybe 2 years ago now, Pete Seeger's annual Hudson River Revival. We had tables of artwork out there. The sun, I can see it, thunderstorm coming right across the river, and it's going to destroy all this artwork by my buddies. And I went frantic trying to save it. Well, it also is a metaphor for days in which we feel that way about much of our lives. Can we hold it together in terms of what we feel is important? And this longish quote is from a book of poetry, an anthology. The bottom line here is that I discovered at a certain point that poetry, by expressing what seems most inexpressible about the war, has led many to healing. This very nicely designed collage is from a middle school where I spoke in Montclair, New Jersey. I try to speak to any age group of people who would invite me. And then currently we have an art show just across the river in Teaneck, New Jersey, the Puffin Cultural Forum. The art is up through April. We have a poetry reading on Friday. I'm also learning how to, by making use of the computer, make hopefully attractive looking flyers. And thank you very much for joining us today. I don't know how to diminish it.
Sure.
Just so everybody can hear, I don't know how many veterans are here. Oh, just so you have some understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder, I'm very curious because the man from, I guess, the consulate of Vietnam? Yeah, and you talked about history, and I'm just curious how in your history books, how you differentiate the soldier, NVA, from the Viet Cong. And I'm just saying this because post-traumatic stress disorder, when you're in combat and you're fighting the opposite, your enemy or a soldier, is much different than fighting someone like a Viet Cong or what we're fighting today in Afghanistan and Iraq and so forth, where you are forced, really forced, to kill innocent civilians to save your own life because they're hiding behind civilians, and you have to live with the fact that you didn't kill the enemy soldier, you tried to save your life, and you ended up killing civilians because that was the issue. And that is what eats a lot of
Yes.
combat veterans.
Yes, and we call that moral injury. We have a new, more accurate term for it, I think. Rather than post-traumatic stress, I think we call it moral injury. But could we hold that until the end? Because I want to get one more speaker, and then we'll respond to it. If not, I'll respond to it. But I think it's an important issue. One of the things we have to live with is what we did and what we became as a result of our experiences in that war. And one of the legacies, before when you spoke, you thanked us for our service, or thanked Chuck for his service. And I really, when people tell me that, I really don't know how to act. I really don't know how to take that, because I just don't know what the service was I performed.
Mac, you're stealing my thunder.
Okay. Okay. I just don't know. So I don't want to steal. I don't want to steal Bill's thunder. But one of the ways in which I lived with what I did and what I became was by hoping that as a result of our legacy and our experiences, we would have learned a damn lesson. It won't happen again. And for a while there, we were tentative. We were hesitant before we would commit to some other quagmire. And it was called by politicians a Vietnam syndrome. We have to get rid of this Vietnam syndrome. And when Reagan come along, he celebrated at last we've overcome the Vietnam syndrome. We could now go and beat up on people. We can now go and involve ourselves in endless, perpetual, immoral war. I would now like to introduce, and let me shut up, because I didn't mean to steal your thunder, Bill. I am really privileged to introduce W.D. Bill Earhart, a Marine Corps veteran of the Vietnam War. A lot of Marines around here. Is the author or editor of some 21 books of poetry and prose. He holds a PhD from the University of Wales at Swansea, I think that is, and teaches history and English at the Haverford School in suburban Philadelphia. I'm privileged to introduce Bill Earhart.
I wasn't expecting to go last, actually. No, we need them on. Yeah, on. I'm very, very low tech. This is my personal electronic device. I can play Jaws with it, which you can't do with your little fancy iPhone things. What I have to say is fairly limited in scope, unlike what our other speakers have done. And I said I hadn't anticipated being the last person because it is kind of narrow, but there's so much I could say about that wall, that big stupid wall down there that I went to see once. It took me 3 years to get there, and I just stood there looking at it thinking it's too fucking small. Where's all the dead people? This thing is about us. The Vietnam War wasn't about us. It wasn't something that happened to a bunch of teenage American boys. We were almost peripheral to what the hell was going on there. The British lost more casualties in the first 12 hours of the Battle of the Somme than we lost in the entire Vietnam War. The Vietnamese lost millions. So it doesn't diminish the pain of those survivors, but I'm not impressed with that wall. And by the way, Susan mentioned that we started our involvement in 1950. The French Army was delivered back to Vietnam in the fall of 1945 aboard American ships. Had Truman said, sorry, you can swim there if you want, there wouldn't have been any Indochina War. But instead, we delivered their troops for them because they didn't have any ships left. But I do want to talk about this business of thank you for your service. People, back in the old days, we used to get welcome home. Like somehow I'm home? Like this is my home? This freaking place? What, because I vote and I don't drool? I'm home? Well, now that's been replaced since 9/11 with thank you for your service. And I'm sorry, but there it was tonight. Thank you for your service. Let me tell you a little bit about the service I performed for my country. When I was 10, I thought that I would live forever. I could kill whatever I pleased. I was all that mattered. How else can one explain the firecrackers stuffed down throats of frogs and lit? Hop, hop, boom. Yeah, a lot of laughs. Once we found a plump snake sunning itself beside the creek. Sluggish in the early morning chill, it only raised its head and turned two diamond black eyes to see 4 small boys with sticks. It didn't understand until we started beating on its flanks that we were dangerous, and it was trapped. Our sticks were too light and we too timid to inflict anything but fury, so we started throwing stones. Small gashes ripped that snake's fat, thrashing sides until it finally tired, though it couldn't run and wouldn't die. It only lay there heaving as the stones fell faster, till a miracle of birth began so strangely even we were brought up short and stood there for a moment dumbly watching. Out of those gashes crawled a dozen baby water snakes, a dozen more, small wriggling slivers of their mother's flesh. Some were bleeding, some had broken backs and dragged limp tails sideways through the dust. Premature, even the ones uninjured that we carried home and put in jars, all died. But it didn't matter. We had frogs and painted turtles, salamanders and a praying mantis. Years later, I volunteered for war, still oblivious to what I'd done or what I was about to do or why. Souvenirs. Bring me back a souvenir, the captain called. Sure thing, I shouted back above the Amtrak's roar. Later that day, the column halted. We found a Buddhist temple by the trail. Combing through a nearby wood, we found a heavy log as well. It must have taken more than half an hour, but at last we battered in the concrete walls so badly that the roof collapsed. Before it did, I took 2 painted vases Buddhists use for burning incense. One vase I kept, and one I offered proudly to the captain. Sighting down the long black barrel, I wait till front and rear sights form a perfect line on his body, then slowly squeeze the trigger. The thought occurs that I have never hunted anything in my whole life except other men. But I have learned by now where such thoughts lead and soon pass on to chow and sleep and how much longer till I change my socks. The next step you take may lead you into an ambush. The next step you take may trigger a tripwire. The next step you take may detonate a mine. The next step you take may tear your leg off at the hip. The next step you take may split your belly open. The next step you take may send a sniper's bullet through your brain. The next step you take, the next step you take, the next step, the next step, the next step. Practically impossible to tell civilians from the Viet Cong. Nobody wears uniforms. They all talk the same language, and you couldn't understand them even if they didn't. They tape grenades inside their clothes and carry satchel charges in their market baskets. Even their women fight, and young boys, and girls. It's practically impossible to tell civilians from the Viet Cong. After a while, you quit trying. We used to get intelligence reports from the Vietnamese district offices. Every night, I'd make a list of targets for artillery to hit. It used to give me quite a kick to know that I, a corporal, could command an entire battery to fire anywhere I said. One day, while on patrol, we passed the ruins of a house. Beside it sat a woman with her left hand torn away. Beside her lay a child, dead. When I got back to base, I told the fellows in the command bunker. It gave us all a lift to know all those shells we fired every night were hitting something. Do they think of me now in those strange Asian villages where nothing ever seemed quite human? But myself and my few grim friends moving through them, hunched in lines, when they tell stories to their children of the evil that awaits misbehavior, is it me they conjure? What if I didn't shoot the old lady running away from our patrol, or the old man in the back of the head, or the boy in the marketplace? Or what if the boy, but he didn't have a grenade? And the woman in Hue didn't lie in the rain in a mortar pit with 7 Marines just for food. Gaffney didn't get hit in the knee. Ames didn't die in the river. Ski didn't die in a medevac chopper between Con Thien and Da Nang. In Vietnamese, Con Thien means place of angels. What if it really was, instead of the place of rotting sandbags, incoming heavy artillery, rats, and mud? What if the angels were Ames and Ski, were the lady, the man, and the boy, and they lifted Gaffney out of the mud and healed his shattered knee? What if none of it happened the way I said? Would it all be a lie? Would the wreckage be suddenly beautiful? Would the dead rise up and walk? Next time you get the urge to thank me for my service, sit down until the urge passes. That's what I did in the service of my country. I'm not proud of it. I've learned to live with it. That's about the best you can do. I want to finish with one thing here. These days I teach high school kids. I also coach winter track. I realize I'm wearing my winter track shirt here. This is called Coaching Winter Track in Time of War. If I can find it. I know it's in here, 74. The boys are running suicides on the football field today. 10-yard increments out to the 50 and back again, push-ups in between. It's 30 degrees, but they sweat like it's summer in Baghdad. Curse like soldiers, swear to God they'll see you burn in hell. You could fall in love with boys like these, so eager, so innocent, so ready to do whatever you ask, so full of themselves and the world. How do you tell them it's not that simple? How do you tell them question it all, question everything, even a coach, even a president? How do you tell them? Ask the young dead soldiers coming home each night in aluminum boxes none of us is allowed to see. An army of shades. You tell the boys good work and call it a day. Stand alone in fading light while memory's phantoms circle the track like weary athletes running a race without a finish line. Thank you.
Before we open up for questions, oh, I did something here. I don't know what that is, but I'll just leave it here. I just want to, let me just read two quick things. This is called Starlight, Starbright. It's a reference to what's called a Starlight scope. It's like a night vision device that we used. It's kind of an archaic thing now compared to what they have, but it was a night vision device. The night, it holds no secrets for me, for I have the power to see into its most impenetrable shadows. I have become brother to the owl, and like the owl, I am a most proficient predator, sitting patiently upon my carefully chosen roost, silently awaiting my prey. It's what I do. It's neither right nor is it wrong, for such judgments mean nothing to one such as I. For this is a wild place, a place of predator and prey, so I wait. And nothing shall escape my cunning. The shadows can offer no sanctuary, for my steady and feelingless glance can penetrate even the darkest of hiding places. My prey shall have no warning, nor shall he hear or see his death swoop down upon him. And then for an instant he will know the horror as he feels the steel of my talons penetrate his skin. And when the ritualistic feast is over, I return to my roost, still savoring a final bit of entrail. It's what I do. Just one more. It's called a rose. I remember once in another lifetime noticing a lone rose rising defiantly from beneath the rubble outside a destroyed village north of Da Nang. It had no business being there, adding color to the drabness of war, beauty to the ugliness of destruction, and hope of life when life held nothing but suffering and death. It was a contradiction and created confusion amidst the clarity of killing to survive. I stepped on it. There are no flowers in a war zone, no color, no beauty, no hope. One of the things that we do, and I know many would look at what's been said tonight and say that we are anti-war and we are anti-military and all that. But there is objective truth out there, ladies and gentlemen. It's not just a matter of opinion. It's not just a matter of perspective. It's not you're right and I'm right. There is objective truth. We have the recordings from the White House. We can hear what Johnson said and what Nixon said. We can hear them talking about the lies. So we're not just unpatriotic. We're patriotic because we're speaking the truth. We want to end the insanity. This is what it's about. This is what we strive for. This is what we've been working 50 years for, and I guess we'll continue to work another 50 years if we have that time on earth. I always say we're going to rave until the grave. I just want to quickly respond to the question before. Look, if I was aggressing someone, if I was raping someone, and they are struggling against my aggression in self-defense, it's not the case that now I can say that, okay, I have a right to self-defense against you utilizing your self-defense. We should have never been there in the first place. And so anytime we're the aggressor, we cannot claim self-defense in order to justify what we did, because there is no justification for what we did. There is perhaps an explanation, but an explanation is not justification. We were wrong, and we have to live with that. And I know we like to spin it. Look, it's much easier to think about ourselves as heroes. We prefer that. I like to think of myself as a hero rather than a dupe. But I like to live in the mythology and the illusion. But you know what? There's no healing from illusion. There's no healing from mythology. If healing is going to occur, it has to occur by facing head on what we did. We have to do away with the mythology. We have to face the facts, call it for what it is, and then try to find a place for it in our being. What Bill was 100% correct. You don't forget about war. We're constantly told when we come home, put the war behind you, put the war, go on with your life. It doesn't happen. You don't put the war behind you. We live with the war every day of our lives. And let me say one thing real quick and end it. There was a famous story about an elderly Vietnam veteran. He goes into the VA and he speaks to some young psychotherapist, and the psychotherapist says to him, well, when were you in Vietnam? So the veteran thinks about it and says, last night. We're ready for questions.
After I served in Vietnam and came back in '63, I was sent to a preparatory school to go to West Point and become an officer, so I was a cadet there. In the summer of 1964, when the Gulf of Tonkin incident, or whatever it was, happened, and I didn't believe it was true, because we were fighting a guerrilla war situation. But at any rate, it struck me that by this time I was 21. This is not what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, was to lie to the American public, attacking people in far distant places in the world for reasons that absolutely made no sense to many of the people in the special forces that I was working with, and that was what their job was, to assess what's going on. So I resigned from West Point, got out of the Army, thought I could write the great American novel that would expose it all. One day somebody gave me a copy of Catch-22, and how did he know? That was World War II. Ultimately, I got so frustrated in all my endeavors to write things that didn't quite keep up with a war that just kept growing bigger and crazier and bizarre and more bizarre. I moved to New York City from New Jersey to look for the peace movement. And I got a job at the New York Public Library, and one day I saw an advertisement in the New York Times, I think the book review section, saying Veterans for Peace. Was something very clever about when North Vietnam starts bombing the United States, we'll sue for peace, or they just turned the whole thing on its head. I thought, this is really good. So I went to this demonstration that was being advertised to start in Central Park in April of 1967 in the March to the United Nations. Huge crowd of people. Boston Globe estimated 400,000 people. The New York Times accepted a much lower number. What thoroughly impressed me is that people came all dressed up as though they were going to church. And as I got there with some friends, I heard somebody say, Vietnam veterans go to the front, and I suddenly realized at the very beginning was what I would call a battalion or larger group of veterans for peace standing in formation, wearing all these hats, many of them wearing Union jackets, many of them would have been in World War II in Korea. At the very beginning of that was a very small group that someone had provided a banner that said Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and we marched over to the United Nations. Everybody went their separate ways, and I discovered there was no organization. I went looking for the people who had participated, any other Vietnam veteran who had listened to me, and it took a number of years because this was obviously not the way to win friends and influence, etc., all of those things of that day, to challenge your own government. We did it for a while. I burned out so many times, I lost track of it. But one of the useful things that we helped to do was to put names to things such as post-traumatic stress disorder that had no name. At the same time we were putting together an anthology of poetry, another group of vets were meeting in what we called rap groups in New York City to try to figure out what is this, what's got to be done about it, who can deal with it. One part of that group, some of them went back to college to get the degrees to provide whatever you can provide for assistance. Another group figured out, how do you put a bill into the hopper and it comes out the other end? Both of these things came together in 1979, the name of post-traumatic stress disorder, and a bill that went through Congress that created the vet centers in the VA, outside of the hospitals, storefronts, staffed by many people who came out of this same milieu, many of whom are still doing this. And so one of the really hidden legacies of that time frame is many people figured out as citizens what to do. The United States government could not figure out what to do. Agent Orange was another one. Vietnam Veterans Against the War and other groups at the time tackled something that, as a newspaper reporter, when I looked into it in 1979, 1980, I ran smack into the cover-up. What cover-up? Well, you weren't supposed to know about the cover-up. And for another 10 years, they got away with the cover-up until Admiral Zumwalt got mad his son had died, and he found the cover-up, and he blew the whistle at the higher levels. This is what we were up against. Every place you turned, you discovered that it wasn't what you thought it was. And what are you going to do about it? You could either do nothing or figure out, who do I have to make common cause with? What kind of networking do I need to do? And that is the legacy that I constantly talk to people about, which the news media always misses, and I worked as a news reporter. People dedicated their lives coming out of that to, this is what I'm going to work on all across this country in all kinds of different kinds of ways, and this country is a hell of a lot better for it. The fact that we couldn't stop a war in Iraq and a war in Afghanistan is what we were up against. Can we stop a war in Syria and a war in Iran? Maybe. So that's the other part of the networking that we do on all kinds of levels. I was at a meeting at the White House last summer. Then the guy we met with suddenly took off and got a job with the American Red Cross and didn't follow through with all the recommendations we gave him. This is the liberal administration. Well, initially we were up against the Johnson administration, which was supposed to have been the liberal administration of the day. And yes, on some things he was good. And then Nixon came along and lied, and created the U.S., created the EPA, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and a whole bunch of other domestic things that were really good. Why he decided that we were the enemy, we had to be on his enemies list, who knows? But we took what we had to say to Washington. We held our own encampment on the Mall in Washington that not only made the history books, it made everybody who participated feel like, you know what, we can do this. It may take a long time. John Kerry was just one of the guys. Who knows if he became president, because I was envisioning I'd have to go picket him. But this is the process, and we work on it in all kinds of different ways. And there were 6 people who had the initial founding meeting of VVAW, simply because you got to have some people do the foundation. But I was running into many Vietnam veterans who said, well, I'll join what you're doing, but I don't really want to publicize my name. I want to stay in the background somehow or other. And yet we did these kinds of speaking engagements in so many different colleges in the tri-state area in 67, 68, 69. I frankly lost track of how many teach-ins I did. And how many, sometimes I go past someplace and, oh, wait a minute, I remember I went to Fordham in the Bronx. I remember I went to Fordham in Manhattan. And I remember I went to Marymount and all the way up the Hudson River and back down again and then across the country. It takes a lot of outreach. But guess what? And this is why, you know, I decided to become a newspaper reporter. Those idiots in the news media don't get it. until you find how, at the grassroots level, to find a reporter who will pay attention to what you're doing at the grassroots level. And so the stories don't appear most of the time in the New York Times. They appear in the Bergen Record, which I worked for as a career. And the local newspapers and regional newspapers and television stations and radio stations all across the country. These days, you just put it on Facebook. My students tell me it's on Twitter. Just go to Twitter. And so that's the other part of what I do. 72 years old, I teach college students to try to help create another generation. They're 20 years old. The Vietnam War is beyond ancient history, until suddenly one of them will say, you know, my father was in Vietnam, or the grandfather. And then you start a conversation, a dialogue that didn't exist previously. That's why even those small organizations don't have the same clout in the news media. They are what, all across this country, make things happen. Long-winded answer.
Thank you for your service now.
Any other questions?
Well, thank you very much for that question, which is extremely difficult to answer, to be very honest with you. But you're right. We somehow have been attractive for the wrong reason, I guess. And foreign forces have just been so keen on occupying our land, reigning our people, and we have fought for the thousands of years that we have existed. I mentioned earlier the Mongols, the empire that was probably the strongest at the time, the Chinese, who again were the strongest in the region at the time, the French, who occupied and colonized major parts of the world, and then came the United States. So I guess that there has always been a love for peace in the bloods of the Vietnamese, and a resolve to make sure that we can enjoy the peace that we want, a resolve that we wouldn't accept any kind of imposition on us, a desire for independence and for being able to make our own decisions by ourselves, and the readiness to sacrifice, if necessary, to defend all those values. I guess that is probably what I can tell from my own kind of feeling and experience, but maybe Bill can also.
I'm not Vietnamese, obviously, but what did you expect them to do? Like turn their AKs into plowshares and register Republican and go to the mall? I mean, they would fight forever. They had 500,000 freaking kids like me ripping their country up, killing them, maiming them. What were they going to do? Give up and say, okay, you can have our country?
But let's be clear, it wasn't something we can say is genetic among the Vietnamese people. Because if you look at the people that were on our side, the South Vietnamese, I mean, I served for about 3 days as an advisor to a Vietnamese outfit, and I found myself alone many times because no one had a desire to fight. So it wasn't merely part of the genetic makeup of a Vietnamese that made them such noble warriors. It had to do with cause and dedication. And obviously the people who were fighting for the freedom had a very different cause and motivation than the people that were fighting for the puppet government and for us. Yes, sir.
As a film major, I've watched a few films that take place in Vietnam. And I was just always curious, wondering, what is your personal opinion or feelings towards films that take place in Vietnam, like Good Morning Vietnam or Apocalypse Now, I believe. Let's not count Rambo. Let's not do that.
If Hollywood were in the business of education, I'd tell my high school students we'd all be at King of Prussia Mall eating popcorn and getting our high school diplomas. Hollywood is in the business of entertainment. And actually, the Rambo movies are better than the others because the Rambo movies are obviously cartoons. Kids go and see movies like Deer Hunter and Platoon, and they think they're seeing the real thing. And it's just entertainment. Just entertainment. The only good movie ever made about the Vietnam War was a box office flop and withdrawn within 3 weeks. Go Tell the Spartans, Burt Lancaster, 1978. Wait, we got the good sergeant and the bad sergeant, like the cartoons I used to watch on TV with the good angel and the bad angel, and when the guy dies, he dies in the... Come on, it's just Hollywood. Sorry.
He's the head of our film department, by the way.
I don't care if he's the Queen of England. It's entertainment. How long did your war last? My war lasted longer than an hour and 25 minutes. My war didn't have a soundtrack. My war didn't star Charlie Sheen. I dropped into the middle of my war while it was going on, and I came out again, and it went on for another 20 fucking years. It's just Hollywood. It's just entertainment.
Yes, sir.
Sorry.
You know, we're not all going to agree. I mean, everyone who went to Vietnam had their own individual experience with their own kind of memories and their own kinds of consequences as a result. So, but we need to keep the dialogue open, and I don't think it's ancient history. I think it has so much relevance to what's going on today. I think it's used. I think it's exploited to continue to send young people out to fight and die for corporate profit and for hegemony. So I think we need to be aware and to become enlightened on it, on this topic and so many others. Do we have any?
Be careful how you use the word we. We did learn something. We did learn something. It's those, some other people didn't. And by the way, I apologize for unloading on you. That was inappropriate. I get excited sometimes, but I do apologize. I started writing when I was 15. I was not going to be the quarterback of the football team. And so I found that poetry was a way that I could, like, if I stick a poem in Linda Titus's locker at lunchtime and I ask her out to the movies in the afternoon, I got a much better chance of getting a date. The urge to write was there before I ever went to Vietnam. I was actually talking this afternoon. There's some poems of mine in Winning Hearts and Minds that I would love to drive a wooden stake through their dark black hearts and make them die forever. Because they're terrible. When I was young, I didn't know how to write. And that was a measure of how little you guys had to pick from for that lousy book. I know a lot of people who went to Vietnam and didn't write. I know a lot of people who are writers and never went to Vietnam. I don't know where I fit into that. It sure gave me a hell of a lot to write about. But I had the urge to write before I ever went there. And even when I was writing about the war, I mean, this is a Vietnam War teach-in, but I got poems about my wife that melt your heart. How do you think she stayed married to me for 34 years, being the jerk that I am? So it's just, you know, it's all, but it's, you know, it's always been there. I wrote a few things, but I very quickly, you know, as the war stopped making any sense to me, by the framework I had been given to understand it, I couldn't, it became too painful to think. I didn't stop writing because I chose to stop writing. I stopped writing because I stopped thinking. All I wanted to do was get the hell out of there and get home in all 10 fingers and all 10 toes. It's probably a blessing because the stuff I did write, a poem I wrote there is in his book, Winning Hearts and Minds, and was put in the first scholarly work on Vietnam War literature as a paradigm example of the worst poetry written about the Vietnam War. So I'm probably lucky that I shut down for a while.
You have any more? Any questions? I just want to finish up with one more poem, and then I invite you to come down and peruse our things, and you have an opportunity to meet with Bill and to purchase one of his books, and I'm sure he'll be glad to sign it for you. This is entitled War Crazy. I have always thought myself a free spirit, a philosopher mendicant seeking an alternative, more substantive lifestyle. So many others, however, see my unorthodoxy, my spiritual seeking as abnormal and a clear indication of my insanity. Perhaps I need to pause and to reevaluate my life. After all, being insane is not something one readily admits. I guess it's part of being crazy to cling to a facade of sanity, to think oneself normal and everyone else insane. One thing I am certain of, however, I haven't always been crazy, wasn't born crazy. I think insanity crept up on me, happened in Vietnam in the war. War does that, you know, drives people crazy. Shell shock, battle fatigue, soldiers, hard PTSD, all that killing and dying can make anyone crazy. Some survive war quite well, they tell me. Many even benefit from its virtues. But war's effects are not always apparent. No one escapes war unscathed in body and in mind. All war, any war, every war. Ain't no virtue in war. I think of those not driven crazy by war. Many were crazy already. But theirs was an insanity of a different kind, a hard kind, an uncaring kind. I knew people like that. Didn't like them much. Thought them fortunate, though, as killing and dying meant nothing. In fact, in a perverse way, they enjoyed it. Enjoyed the jazz, the excitement, the power. They became avenging angels, even God herself, making decisions of life and death, but mostly death. Those crazies hated to see the war end. For me, the war never ends. Sometimes things work out for the best, though, as my unorthodoxy, my being crazy, probably saved my life. You see, sane people can't live like this in a war that never ends. Not all crazy people can either. Guess I was lucky. Sometimes being crazy helps you cope. Sometimes I wish I was crazier than I am. Join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you for coming. Many people I don't want back in my country, but I can assure you Mr. Griffith's name is at the top of the list. So evidently he was doing something right. So we have a wonderful, diverse program that we have. We have some great speakers for you, and we're relying on our technology to enable us to talk with Da Nang, Vietnam, over Skype. Hopefully, everyone keep their fingers crossed that the technology is going to work. I am privileged to introduce our first speaker, Susan Schnall. She was an active duty Navy nurse during the American conflict in Vietnam in 1969. And I mean, she's proud of this, and well, she should be. She was tried and found guilty by a general court-martial for conduct unbecoming an officer. And here's what she And this is what she was doing. I mean, she's going to tell you the story, but she commandeered a plane and she started dropping leaflets all over the place, and they didn't appreciate her efforts, I don't think. She has been active in the Medical Committee for Human Rights, Medical Aid for Indochina, and GI coffee houses. Susan is a member of the core of the Vietnam Agent Orange Relief and Responsibility Campaign, Veterans for Peace, Vietnam Veterans, Subversive Vietnam Veterans Against the War. She organized and led a delegation of science public health professionals to Vietnam in 2013 to survey the land that had been contaminated by Agent Orange, and I'm sure she'll tell you about that. She is now teaching at NYU in the School of Professional Studies. She teaches health policy and planning. And for 31 years, Susan worked in the executive administration at a number of public hospitals in New York City, retiring as a very young person from Bellevue Hospital Center in 2006. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Susan Schnall.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, and it's a pleasure to see all of you. And you don't need to turn the lights off. I teach, and I'm always concerned that my students are going to fall asleep. So,
I thought you can see your slides.
right, I just have to get them on. Could somebody help us just get the slideshow up? And I'll start. You can all hear me, right? Okay. I just wanted to continue what Mac had started in terms of, tell me if you see planes outside. If I see planes, it would be a little too late, I think. But nothing happened. So that was our publicity for the GI and Veterans March for Peace on October 12th, 1968. And as Max said, I faced a captain's mast, an Article 32 hearing, and then a general court-martial, at which I was found guilty of disobeying a general Navy regulation because I participated in the anti-war demonstration while wearing my uniform. My defense was General Westmoreland could go to Congress and be positive and ask for more money for this war in Vietnam. I can wear my uniform speaking out about peace. That was one of my defenses. The other one was conduct of becoming an officer and a gentlewoman by dropping the flyers on the military bases, urging people to disaffect from the war. And I said, yes, that was true, but in my worldview, that was conduct becoming an officer, because one did what one's conscience said this was what we had to do. So that takes you back a few years to 1969. As I said, I was found guilty. I faced 5 years at hard labor. The problem at this time was where were they going to put a woman? So they gave me, the court-martial board gave me a sentence of 6 months at hard labor. But because they had a general Navy regulation that said if a woman received a sentence under a year, she didn't necessarily have to serve it. So they sent me back to full duty. But they placed me off of the active duty units because we continued to organize. So let me take you back to those years and start with a picture of Vietnam before the United States got heavily involved. And you know, I'm saying that kind of with tongue in cheek because there's some information I'd like to share with you tonight. First, to show you where Vietnam is. It is 6,000 miles away from the United States. There was never an immediate threat to this country, to the safety and security of this country. That was obvious. It is surrounded by the Gulf of Tonkin, and please take a look at where the Gulf of Tonkin is. It is off the coast of Vietnam. It's right there. Is that international waters? I don't know. A little bit about myself and how I found myself in the United States Navy in 1967. And I think about it today and think, yeah, I should have known better, right? I knew about the conflict going on in Vietnam. But I thought I would join as a nurse and I'd heal those people who had been wounded by war. I went in to take care of the guys who had been sent overseas. And what I realized is hearing their stories, hearing what they told me they had participated in, and what they had seen in Vietnam, that I was now a part of the military establishment. And I said, no, I can't do this. I feel that it conflicts with my moral compass. So I need to do something. This is 1967. I was just speaking with Jan Berry and said, you know, in 1967, when I went into the military, Howard Levy was being court-martialed. And I remember thinking, wow, if he can stand up to the military, maybe at some point I'll have enough courage to say something. It wasn't until a year and a half later when we were organizing a GI and Veterans March for Peace in the San Francisco Bay Area that I got the idea, and it was not a particularly original idea, but we had to distribute flyers and information to members of the military so they could participate. We put posters up at my hospital, which was Oak Knoll Naval Hospital in Oakland, California. It was a group of GIs, corpsmen and corps waves, who I worked with. So we put our posters up and we handed out the flyers, and they were all torn down. And then I remember seeing on the news, and those of you who are my generation will remember this, that the United States military was dropping flyers in the southern part of Vietnam, urging the Vietnamese to go to camps where they would be safe. And I thought, you know, if the United States can do this in Vietnam, why can't I do that in the United States? I had a friend who was a pilot, and we loaded up this private plane, a single-engine plane, and dropped flyers announcing the peace demonstration on the Presidio, on Treasure Island, on Yerba Buena Island, on Oak Knoll Naval Hospital, and on the deck of the aircraft carrier that was stationed at Alameda Naval Air Station. And to this day, I remember the pilot saying to me, Susan,
they would bringing into existence whether or not it would get any response from the community, the college community or the student body. What they found was that at 8 p.m. when it started, just about now, some 220 college professors showed up and some 3,000 students showed up for the first teaching. It went from 8 p.m. till 8 a.m. tomorrow morning. So we can be here for a while if you like, except SVA is going to throw us out of here at 10 o'clock. And it was probably the first opportunity many students and many college professors may have as well to learn about this strange place, Vietnam, that pretty much no one had heard of back then. It was an opportunity for people to discuss whether or not they were being informed and whether they were being informed the truth about what was going on. They discussed the war and they discussed the draft. So it's fitting, I think, that 50 years later, we again meet to discuss the Vietnam War. Philip Jones Griffith, who you just met, went to Vietnam, a photojournalist, a photographer, freelance, worked for Magnum, and went to Vietnam in 1966, I believe, and started to do what he does. Unfortunately, his images were not highly saleable. No one wanted them because they kind of pictured what we don't want to know about war, what we don't want to see about war. He did a lot from the Vietnamese perspective, not the mythological American perspective that we wanted to embrace. Eventually, I think it was 1971, he continued about 3 years doing his photography in Vietnam. In 1971, he published Vietnam Inc. Vietnam Inc. is pretty much hailed as one of the best pieces of photojournalism of its time. It had such a dramatic impact on how the war was being perceived. Probably what heralds Philip Jones Griffiths most was that President II of South Vietnam acknowledged his work, and I quote, he said, "Let me tell you, there are
My name is Bob Milgram. I'm co-chair of the Humanities and Sciences Department at the School of Visual Arts. And basically, I want to welcome you all. Okay, I'm not? Is it okay now? Okay. I'd just like to welcome you all to this event, a very important event. There are great lessons to be learned from the Vietnam War, especially for us now at this point involved in the endless war against terror. I'm sure the people that are going to speak with you will draw the connections between the bogus attack in the Tonkin Gulf on an American destroyer, an attack that never happened that led us into that war, with all the casualties you just heard about, and the bogus connection between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, the bogus contention of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and so on. I'm not going to take time to go through all this. Most of you are already all too aware. Two people here were, thank you, basically contributors and creators of a collection of poetry, Winning Hearts and Minds, about the done all by Vietnam combat veterans, a book that I use in the classroom. It's a lot of years, since 1972, and it meant a lot to all of us, and that's Jan Barry. I'm sorry. I think I better stop right here and turn it over to Mac.
Thank you, Bob. I want to also welcome you to our teach-in. What's interesting, and I can't claim to have been aware of that when I planned this, but today is the actual 50th anniversary of the first teach-in, which was held at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. And it was planned by, tentatively and hesitantly planned by 10 professors and 10 equally hesitant students, members of SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, not knowing what they